if you can engage in the imagination, if you can create an environment where the imagination becomes the context for what you're doing in the classroom, then you are expanding almost infinitely what can be, where you can be, when you can be, what you're doing, who you are, and what you're up to, because the imagination could take you anywhere.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Rethinking Education podcast. We made it all the way to double figures. The last episode with Kate McAllister has been going down well. Here's a message I received from a new listener yesterday. I've just listened to this in full. Wow, an inspiring and sensible conversation. Thanks so much for recording this and allowing parents a glimpse of the conversations some of you educators are having. Change is overdue. This podcast makes me feel hopeful. That's a big deal. Deborah Kidd, who some of you may know was my very first guest, an episode well worth going back and listening to in case you haven't done so already, tweeted, "Some people think one day I'd really like to ... and some people do it." Rethinking Kate's story is a fascinating one. And finally, here's a message I received from Catherine Pratt, someone I met virtually only recently through the Rethinking Education Mighty Network. Catherine has been doing some really fascinating work with something called the Soini Project down in Cornwall. And she is a fascinating example of someone who is rethinking education in a way that aligns learning with families, the environment, and engaging with the wider community. Catherine tweeted, "Kate is extraordinary. This clip is so powerful standing on its own." I had clipped a part of the show where Kate outlined her philosophy of education. And then she adds in brackets, "The rest of the podcast will realign your neural connections too," close brackets, and sums up her why beautifully. These people can't all be wrong, listener. If you haven't done so already, I heartily recommend you go back and listen to Kate's episode. It really is most life-affirming. She is continuing to receive the most incredible feedback from the parents of children at her Hive school. And of course, I equally recommend you go back and listen to the entire back catalogue. It's all gold, and we have some fantastic guests lined up in the weeks to come. The next episode will feature a fascinating conversation with Ross McGill, also known as Teacher Toolkit, the most followed teaching account on Twitter. I think it's got something like 250,000 followers, which is unbelievable. We also passed a mini milestone of our own this week, tipping over 1,000 downloads. In fact, we're already up to around 1,300, which is a wonderful thing after just a couple of months of being on the air. And considering that these episodes tend to be around the 2 to 3 hour mark, a quite remarkable and entirely welcome thing. I absolutely love doing this podcast. I would literally do it if nobody listened. It forces me to read fascinating books and have in-depth conversations with inspiring people. But it is quite time-consuming. It takes about 10 hours to process a single show. And so it is really lovely to hear that these conversations are resonating with people. If you've been enjoying these podcasts, I would love to hear from you somehow. For example, you might be able to write a glowing review or give us a 5-star rating on whichever of the many platforms you can access it through. You might also be able to leave a comment or share a link to the show with your social media buddies. Also, if you have any recommendations for future guests, please feel free to drop me a line. My contact details are in the show notes. You can also join the Rethinking Education Mighty Network, like Catherine did, a free online community forum that I set up about a month ago, almost on a whim really, on the night Lockdown 3 was announced. So far, around 80 people have joined this community, and it's a really global affair. There are people from about 12 different countries represented, scattered all over the planet. The idea behind this mighty network is to bring together people from all walks of life, parents and carers, teachers and school leaders, researchers and policymakers, people with kids in the school system, parents of homeschoolers or school refusers, anyone really who is interested in rethinking and reforming education at whatever level of the system they are at, whether they're inside the system or outside it, to see whether we might work together and scale up our efforts to bring about a less hair-raising, more harmonious state of world affairs. There's also a free online course, Learning to Learn at Home, which, to my delight, has been well received among teachers as well as parents and carers. A teacher contacted me this week to say that he had used one of the tools, it's called Steps to Success, as the basis for a 30-minute school assembly, and he's also using it with his pupils, which is nice. If you're interested, you can join the community at rethinking-education.mn, that's short for Mighty Network, .co, or you can download the Mighty Networks app and search for Rethinking Education. We haven't done much with this community yet. I just want to grow it, first of all, to around 200 or 300 people, and then we'll have a live launch event in a few weeks and really get the ball rolling. So do come and join us. It is quite simply the loveliest bunch of people you're ever likely to find assembled on the internet. If you're a regular listener to this show, you will have noticed that I like to spend a good amount of time getting to know each guest before we get into the Rethinking Education part of the conversation. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure whether this would work, especially as I always ask my guests to talk about their own childhoods and their experiences of education. But 10 episodes in, I'm really pleased that I made the decision to go down this route. In every single episode to date, the life history, significant learning part of the conversation has been absolutely fascinating, and today's episode is no exception. Tim Taylor is a writer and a freelance teacher who works to promote and develop innovative practices in primary schools. He's also the author of A Beginner's Guide to Mantle of the Expert, and he runs training events and residentials and so on for teachers seeking to develop this aspect of their practice. We'll explore Mantle of the Expert in some detail in this conversation, but in case you aren't familiar, by way of a one-line introduction, it's an approach to teaching and learning that involves engaging the children in a process of what Tim describes as imaginative inquiry. Working with Luke Abbott and others, Tim has helped to grow a sizable community of practice around this approach in recent years, and it's well worth a visit to the Mantle of the Expert website, which I'll link to in the show notes, and also to have a look at Tim's book, which is absolutely brilliant. Tim will probably not thank me for saying this because he's quite humble, but I honestly think that he is one of the most remarkable educators I've ever met. As I mentioned in this conversation, I've seen Tim in action when I took part in a workshop he ran at a conference. Although this was about 5 years ago, I can still remember so many details from that session and the strange way it made me feel. It was utterly unlike anything I had ever seen or taken part in before or since. Tim has an incredible talent for taking simple artifacts, a newspaper article or an object or a photograph, and using them to create an intimate shared space in which mystery, imagination, and possibilities for learning abound. It really is quite astonishing, and I think that comes across in this conversation. Tim is also widely regarded as one of the loveliest, most decent people you'll ever meet, online or in real life, and particularly in the world of edu-Twitter, which sometimes feels more like a school playground or perhaps even the Wild West at times than a place for professional dialogue among adults. Tim's story of his childhood and his experience of school in this episode is particularly powerful, I think. He had a very extreme experience of the transition from primary to secondary school, a transition he describes as a guillotine, which is quite a telling metaphor, I think. And it makes me wonder, just how widespread is this sense among children that the move from primary to secondary school is not so much a question of transition, as it's often referred to by teachers, but as a seismic and perhaps even traumatic jolt that they never really fully recover from or get their heads around. There are strong echoes here of the conversation I had with Ian Cunningham in episodes 2 to 4. That was a long conversation, where we talked about how secondary schools in particular are often far too large. This, as always, is a fascinating conversation in which we discuss some of the ludicrous educational fads and bizarre beliefs that have gripped the teaching profession in recent years, the powerful potential of mantle of the expert, of course, and the troubling fact that if you were going to change the education system, you wouldn't want to start from here. Before we dive in, a quick comment on sound. For some reason, towards the end of our conversation, a strange, intermittent clicking sound appeared. For those of you old enough to remember Flipper the dolphin, it sounds a bit like Flipper trying to draw our attention to a tourist in distress or an imminent art heist, perhaps. Like the true professional that he is, Tim did not let Flipper distract him from talking to me about education. If you too hear this pesky crime-solving dolphin piping up at any point, do not adjust your settings. Just ignore him and he'll soon go away. Okay, that's quite enough of that. On with the show. Tim Taylor, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm very excited. I think to be talking to you this morning. Yeah.
I think it was maybe 2013 when I first came across you, and we met, if you remember, in the chat comments in the comment section on The Guardian. I'd written one of those secret teacher columns. I think that it's okay for me to unmask 7 years down the line, not that anyone cared even at the time. I'd written a piece about we need to free education from political control or something, and there was a healthy, robust dialogue, let's say, in the comment section, and a range of views were expressed. And you stuck at it for quite a good time, and I did as well, and it was clear that we had some sort of quite similar ideas about things. And at that time, I don't think I was even on Twitter. I think that you probably introduced me to Twitter, and it was you who encouraged me to start blogging and to just engage in this world of edu Twitter, which I know that you've been very immersed in from that time. What are your memories of your early experiences of engaging with this world?
Yeah, so I had a pretty similar path. So I suppose I was only a couple of steps ahead of you. So I was on, I started looking at the comments section underneath the articles that were happening in The Guardian. And as you say, it was a pretty robust and interesting conversation that was going on. And, a number of very interesting people. Also, the format allowed you to say quite a lot. So it was a sort of a semi-blogging type thing for some people. And I kind of felt that it was giving me the opportunity to broaden my horizons and talk to people that weren't in my social kind of group or circle. And then actually I was introduced to Twitter by Hugh Roberts and a bunch of other people who said, look, you should, if you like that sort of thing, you should go on Twitter. So I think I'd only been on Twitter maybe a few weeks. And then we were chatting quite regularly on The Guardian, and I think I said, "Oh, look, you should get over there. Yeah, there's another arena for this kind of stuff. A little bit more sort of knockabout, because obviously back then, particularly, Twitter had very short amount of characters, but it kind of happened fast. I think that was the thing, that it was Twitter, as we know, you kind of get into these conversations pretty quickly, and things are going backwards and forwards. Whereas kind of the Guardian comments thing was kind of long form, wasn't it? You'd write something and then you'd wait half a day or a day for someone to reply, or like a series of correspondence.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it has been an incredible tool, hasn't it? It really has. The extent of sort of sharing of practice, and it just feels like there's been this very sort of accelerated period of growth in the profession, and it really feels like the profession is sort of starting to find its feet, to become much more sort of research engaged, much more willing to engage with ideas from the other side of the aisle, as it were. And it allowed teachers, classroom teachers, and education researchers to come face to face for the first time. Because previously, teachers, didn't even go to conferences, did they? Not really much of a thing apart from uni and stuff. And education researchers go to things like BIRA, which costs like 200 quid to go to. But this format allowed teachers and education researchers to start talking to each other. And it feels like there was this sort of fascinating. I sometimes use an image when I'm talking about this, and it's like these two mountaineers on two opposing sort of rock faces, and both of them have got a rope dangling down. And it sort of felt like that was what happened, that it almost felt like sort of teachers were assuming that education researchers were doing things that were sort of somehow relevant to classroom practice, and vice versa. I assume at least that education researchers were assuming that teachers were, to at least to some extent, reading and digesting and acting on research findings. And the gap is really, really considerable. Donald McIntyre wrote about it really well, where he sort of said that it's just like the kinds of knowledge that researchers are producing is just of a very different nature to what teachers need to know to teach their tricky Year 6 group on a Tuesday morning. And it felt like the other one thought that the other had the rope, and then we sort of had this weird facing off, and now there's been this fascinating sort of merging of these two worlds, and we can see this happening through movements like Research Ed and through Teach Meets and these sort of grassroots things, but I think largely through online engagement. And also schools have engaged with universities, university-based researchers for a long time, and that's work that I'm currently involved in. But that's generally been in quite sort of small pockets, and it feels like it's really gone sort of, I don't know whether you'd call it system level yet, but it's certainly ramped up considerably.
Yeah, I think because I was involved in research and education in the late 90s and early 2000s, and the Labour government funded quite a lot of things called best practice research, so you could get a scholarship quite easily, and that actually had a quite significant effect on my career, because it allowed me to pay for somebody called Luke Abbott to come and work with me in my classroom, and other people that I was working with, and I was interested in that world, and I also sort of travelled around quite a bit, went to different universities, went up to Newcastle, and there was a conference in the Midlands and other places, and I had the BIRA journal. I was subscribed to that, and that arrived at our school, and I would read it. And I felt that there was an attempt at that time to try and join those two worlds together. I think it never really kind of worked, because it always felt like there was a gatekeepers. There were the people who were deciding what got published, and what kind of was allowed to be in the journals, and what kind of things made it and what kinds of things were dismissed. And I think the big shift for us as a profession in terms of engaging with that world was the development of blogging, where there's no gatekeepers in blogging. You can just write, and there's nobody stopping you or checking it or disapproving or saying, oh, that's not how you do it. You just kind of do it. And I think it allowed an awful lot of us, particularly, I don't see quite the same amount of energy in blogging as there was 5 or 6 years ago. There was an enormous, sometimes you'd be 100 blogs a week. Saturday morning, there'd be 30 or 40 blogs published, promoted on Twitter.
There definitely seem to be fewer comments on blogs as well. There used to be raging arguments in the comment section on blogs, and I don't see that happening so much anymore.
No, absolutely. And I think, I kind of worked my head through this and thought to myself, well, why is that? Why might that be? And I think there's been a little bit of a conversation about it on Twitter. And my thought is that an awful lot of the things that were pressing on the profession, things that weren't examined and were brought to classes, things like teacher talk. Teacher talk was something that sort of, for some reason or other, and I think you talked a bit about this in your book, is that teacher talk became a bad thing. We got shown sort of I don't know, data that said that teachers talked for 80% of the time in a class, And all of us nodded and went, oh, yeah, that's a bad thing. We've got to stop doing teacher talk. And I think quite a lot of us actually sat there and thought, oh, I don't know if that's right. Is it just a bad thing? Have we just got to stop doing it so much? And it needed examining. And I think there was a lot of those kinds of things, particularly in the early days. I'm saying the early days, what we're talking about 6 or 7 years ago, in blogging, where a lot of those kinds of ideas needed talking about and looking at more closely. And I wonder if a lot of those things that were pressing on us as a profession at that time, are no longer so urgent.
Yes, yeah, maybe. And we have worked through, in all of those raging conversations, people have worked through a lot of the ideas that they were having. It's a bit like, that theory of sort of how groups form, and there's like the storm, form, norm. Have you come across this? So when a group gets together, there's a period of storm. So there's feathers are flying, and people are sort of trying to establish where they are in the sort of hierarchy or within the whole sort of ecosystem. And then there's a period of norming where people start to find their feet, and then there's like reform, and there's this whole sort of theory of it, and it feels like edu Twitter was in a sort of micro storm, and it feels like Twitter more widely, and the sort of the culture wars, if you like, that have sort of happened partly, at least as a consequence of the internet and social media, is like this absolutely raging torrential storm that is potentially unending. It's hard to see how that's going to reach the level of norm. Goodness knows, I hope that it will. But anyway, so there does seem to be maybe that there was a storm element of the edu Twitter thing, and then people have sort of decided largely sort of where they sit in terms of traditional practice versus progressive ideas and so on. And maybe sort of people have become a bit less interested in exploring them for themselves because they've sort of already examined that. And just quickly on the teacher talk thing, I mean, I've thought about that a lot as well, and it's one of those things that's just not a straightforward thing, is it? Like, you can't just say teachers should not talk for X amount of minutes, which is what people were saying. But I can sort of understand where it came from, because I can remember, just as my own classroom practice, like I know, like I've felt it many times, the moment when I lose a class because I've been talking too long, and they just glaze over, and one of them just looks out the window, and you can just get a sense. You're just like, okay, I've lost them here. I need to shut up, and I need to get them doing something. And and I think that probably people who've observed teachers have seen that for a long time. And there's a tendency to sort of, we talk to control sometimes. Like when you're talking, like you're in control of the situation, regardless of how well that bit of teacher talk is going. So I can sort of understand why people were criticising teacher talk, but just to suddenly say, oh yeah, the kids were on the carpet for more than 10 minutes, therefore this was an unsatisfactory lesson, was where it became ridiculous. There's a complicated conversation to be had about teacher talk, and that's not what was happening.
No, and it's the point you're making there is that teaching is situated. It's in a classroom with 30 other human beings. It's not, you can't apply a formula to it. The first time that I became aware of this was in primary, which is where I spent almost all my career. We in the sort of late 90s, the literacy hour turned up, and there were literally people sitting, I'm saying people, Ofsted, sitting in the classroom with a stopwatch, timing the amount of time that you're on the carpet for, and how long you're talking for, and as a school, we were at the same time we were working on philosophy with children, and forest schools and other stuff, and we were like looking at this and going, this is madness. What? This is a formula that's been applied by people who've never even visited our school, let alone sat in a classroom with the children that we're working with. It's deprofessionalizing us. It's taking away from us our judgment as teachers and our sense of what it is to be able to adapt in the classroom to what's needed in the room. Like you're saying, you're talking for too long because you notice that some of the children start becoming disengaged. Now, as a teacher, that's a clear sign that you've got to change things up. It's not like after 10 minutes or 11 minutes or 5 minutes. I mean, we were told such silly things like, young children can only be on the carpet, or can only concentrate for 5 minutes plus their age. So apparently, like a 6-year-old can only concentrate for 11 minutes. Well, where the hell did that come from? It was it was like I remember being told that several times at various things that I attended, because
That's
at one point
amazing.
I used to go all these things at one point because I was really interested in new ideas and what was going on. I was still a young teacher or a new teacher and finding things out. And I remember sitting there looking and going, that's bullshit. That's just not true. I see that every day that's not true. Where has that come from?
Yeah.
And I think that kind of thing needed examining, and I think it's now you can't get away with stuff like that anymore.
No.
People in their profession ask questions.
I mean, it's a very simple equation as well, isn't it? You'd think it would be something like your age plus 5 minutes divided by your socioeconomic status times by your shoe size or something. Maybe a bit closer to the truth.
Water you've drunk that morning, or
Indeed, yeah, the water is all important. Water, yeah. So I mean, you're talking about reprofessionalizing the teaching there, and I think that is what's happening. It's like the short version of this conversation that we're having. I think that through all of this engagement with research and tweeting and blogging and so on, and I know that it's still a minority of teachers who are engaged in this online world, which is something to remember sometimes. But it does feel like the profession is becoming more sure-footed, more confident. And to go back to that original Secret Teacher article, this idea that we need to free education from endless political tinkering, I think that that's still a valid point. But at the time, people were saying, yeah, but we're telling kids to drink water because you need to press it into the top of their mouth because then it'll be absorbed into their brain, and we're pressing our brain gym buttons and we're doing all this weird stuff. And clearly, teaching doesn't have its house in order. So we're not in a position yet where we could make a strong case to the government and say, actually, we know what we're talking about here. Maybe you need to devolve this to a select committee or something and stop with the sort of electoral cycle, political football of educational ideas, which feels to me to be what's happening, which is, all to the good, obviously. Just to pick something up, you mentioned Luke Abbott there, and I know we're going to talk about Mantle of the Expert in a while because you're probably like most known for your work in Mantle of the Expert. So just as a way to foreshadow it, if you like, for a while, I don't know if it's still your Twitter bio, but for a while your Twitter bio said something like, the greatest resource we have in the classroom is the children's imagination. Which I remember thinking, I've not really, because I'm a secondary school teacher and a science teacher, and there's not a whole lot of scope, there's a lot of content to cover, and I remember sort of thinking, I don't really know what that means. So could you just shed some light on what you mean by that? Why is it the greatest resource?
Well, the reason is that, for me anyway, is that if you can engage in the imagination, if you can create an environment where the imagination becomes the context for what you're doing in the classroom, then you are expanding almost infinitely what can be, where you can be, when you can be, what you're doing, who you are, and what you're up to, because the imagination could take you anywhere. And in the sort of the time that I was a teacher, when I was thinking about these things very much in terms of my practice, was that I was finding that when I was working with children, if we engaged in story worlds, if we started to think about what we were doing inside a story, which is where Mantle the Expert comes in terms of the practice of that, then the kinds of resources you need become very, very simple. You just need bits of paper. You need a place to be. You might need some tape to put on the carpet, because most of what's going on, I'll explain the tape thing. So if you want to be in an Egyptian tomb, for example, so if you want to explore ancient Egypt with the kids, so you're engaged in that kind of thing, and you think to yourself, right, so what about if we were a bunch of people coming into an Egyptian tomb, opening up like Howard Carter for the first time? I mean, what would that be like? do you suppose? Now, of course, that's an imaginative question because the children have never been in that position. And, I can't imagine any of them, certainly the children I was working with in the late 90s, even been to Egypt or thought about Egypt. So how can you summon that place up? How can you kind of imagine yourself being there? And all you need is a piece of sort of masking tape, a roll of masking tape, and just mark it out on the floor. And then say to them, okay, let's just imagine ourselves stepping into that place and being these people for the first time. What do you suppose we might find there? What would we see? Now, of course, your imagination takes you there, just like you would if you were watching a film or reading a book or being at the theatre. Your imagination takes you there, and this is what I saw with the children: was that they were you could do this. All kids could do this, and they were there in that place. And the point of it is, you go, I'll tell you what. Why don't we just stop our story for a minute and just find out more about what it was like for Howard Carter? Let's have a look at some photographs of what you found. Let's have a look at the topic books and see what kinds of artifacts were in there. Why don't you grab a piece of paper and draw them, and then we'll come back to our story, and then we'll put them into the tomb, but not as the archaeologists, but as the people who were attending the ceremony of Tutankhamun at the time. So we're going to take ourselves back 5,000 years and imagine what that was like. We're going to do that. Now that work that's involved in that is connecting up all the curriculum, and it's happening largely inside our imagination. And that was the realization for me, was that you don't really need a huge amount of resources. You don't need lots and lots of expensive things and complicated kind of apparatus. You could do almost all of it in your head with your imagination. And that's a power that we all have.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I can see that. So in a sense, like the children's imagination acts as a kind of multiplier effect. So all you need is, like you say, a few sheets of paper or some photographs or a bit of tape on the floor. And through that, you create a world, and the children sort of buy into it. They suspend their disbelief. They buy into it. And through that, you create a sort of a momentum, or a sort of like a narrative with which you can then develop, for example, ideas about history or ideas about spelling and grammar or whatever it is that needs to happen within the context of the curriculum. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Right. So if you think about it in terms of the curriculum, so obviously you can see there's lots of history in it, because the people that are involved in creating this imaginary story, which is the children, they need to know a lot about history. So what are the ways that they can find out about history? They can look at books, they can look at photographs, they could maybe watch a documentary. But there's also me. I know a lot about history, so I can tell them a lot. And of course, because they're interested in it and they're engaged in it, then they want to know. They're asking questions, and they get more and more excited and interested in it, like you do when you see children doing that. Now, as a teacher, of course, I'm keeping an eye on all the other things that I want the children to learn. So let's say they're seven or eight, and they're becoming more competent writers. They're starting to write longer things. So I look at the kinds of text types that I might want to teach them about and develop. And I see on that list there's something about like a first-person perspective account of this event. And I think to myself, well, what writing could there be in that context? Well, now I've got a whole load of options here. I've got the option of it could be an account written by one of the archaeologists. We went down the dark corridor and we saw above us the stars that were painted into the ceiling, and there the closed door sealed shut. That's a first person perspective of the archaeologists. Or it could be the first person perspective of somebody who was watching this. I saw the archaeologists disappear into the mountain and come back 3 hours later, their eyes full of joy. Now that's another perspective. Or we could go back to the time of the Egyptians. So I carried in my box and laid it on the tomb and said goodbye to my son. I touched the stone, the cold, hard stone that was as cold as his skin. That's a first-person perspective from somebody who was there at the event at the time. So you can see I've got all these options to me because we've created this context. Now, for the children, of course, they're not thinking about that at all. What they're thinking about is the story. So if I say to them, I wonder if somebody who was there at the time wrote down what they experienced. Perhaps they were writing to a relative, somebody who wasn't there. Or perhaps they were keeping an account that was in a book that's long gone now, turned to dust. I wonder what that would sound like. The kids go, yeah, I'll write that. That sounds interesting. And you're not fishing around trying to find activities. This was the thing that as a teacher, when I first started teaching, frustrated me, was that I had all these things that I needed to teach, and then I had to create activities, and then I had to get the children interested in the activities. And most of the time, they weren't really interested in it because they just felt like, I suppose for them, they just felt like, oh, we're just doing this because that's what you do when you're at school. There's not a kind of a purpose to it. As a student, I'm not invested in this. It doesn't concern me. I'm doing it. I mean, I'm sure you can remember. I can remember doing lots of stuff at school that just felt like practicing for something that I probably was never going to do. I mean, I can remember putting my hand up in a maths class. The teacher was teaching us algebra, and I put my hand up and I said, I can't see myself doing this. He went, what do you mean? I said, I just can't see myself using this. What is it? Why are we doing it? And I don't think anybody ever asked him. And I don't blame him. I just think that that's an awful lot of what we do at school, is we do stuff. But Dorothy Heathcote, who's a great hero of mine, said that, that school, if you're not careful, school could turn into a waiting room, a place where you're waiting for something to happen. And that the students are kind of there, they're kind of practicing for something that might be useful for them one day, but not today. There isn't a reason to do it today. It's like, if you talk to 7-year-olds, they say, why are we doing this? You go, if the best answer you've got is it'll pass exams and then you'll get a better job. Well, for a 7-year-old, that sounds like an awful long time away.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, all right. Well, I'll work hard when I'm 15 or something, catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is what kids think often. I mean, I'm really interested in Mantle of the Expert, and I'm coming at it from a position of a complete beginner, really. But I've seen you in action. I saw you run a session once at Northern Rocks, and that was with adults. But I remember thinking of it as almost like a kind of strange alchemy, that you create this sort of environment in which possibilities abound. And in my conversation with Debbie Kidd, you mentioned Dorothy Heathcote there, and she talked about how Heathcote used to use the metaphor of a crucible, that children are like a crucible, and that you sort of stir the pot and something sort of wonderful emerges if you allow the space in which for this work to happen. So I know that we're going to get into Mantle of the Expert a little bit more, but first of all, I want to sort of take you back. It's one of the things that I sometimes find frustrating when I listen to podcasts, is that people often ask the guest, can you give me a potted history of your life up to this point? And it's like 2 minutes sort of answer. And I always think that's like the most interesting bit of the story. Like, why is it that you became the Mantle of the Expert guy, right? And so I'm really interested. And why did I become the person that I am? Because, we all approach education from very different perspectives, with different life experiences, with different moments of significant learning that have shaped us as people. And so that's why we see so much conflict, I think, on Twitter, because we're sort of we're arguing in the minutiae, and we're not really taking account of the wider context of one another's lives. And somebody who you feel like you're the mortal enemy of, who you disagree with, and you bang heads against them constantly, if you take the time to get to know them and understand who they are and why they are the way that they are and what it is that they're trying to achieve, you can often find immense areas of common ground, And so I'm interested to explore life histories. So let's go back to your childhood. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience of childhood, your experience of school? Let's just start with that.
Okay. So my childhood divides really quite neatly, or almost talking about the crucible, almost like a guillotine that kind of chops it in half between when I was at primary and when I was at secondary. My primary education was in a tiny school in the Fens, a place called Lakes End. It's one street. You can have a look at it on Google Earth. There's, I don't think there's more than 70 people lived there in the 1970s. And our school had 15 children in it, from reception to year 6. And 3 of them were me, my brother, and my sister.
Wow.
And I'm 5 years older than my sister, was 6 years older than my brother. And my dad was our teacher. And we lived in the schoolhouse, which was connected to the building. So you could imagine it was a very, very kind of isolated kind of childhood. And I had very, very few people that I was the same age of and had anything in common with. So I very instinctively, I think, I don't think it was never a conscious choice. You didn't make a conscious choice at that age. It was just an instinct thing that I would go off in my imagination. I would spend a huge amount of my time inside my head, imagining myself, in a story that would make up for myself, doing all kinds of things. And I don't know, from an adult perspective, perhaps I was an odd child, perhaps, but I don't think my parents ever considered me odd. I don't even think I would consider me odd if I saw myself now, because it's all going on up in my head. And I would spend a lot of time out in the fields around where I lived, or in a dike somewhere, living adventures and playing games in my head. And I learned to read. It took me a little while to learn to read, but I learned to read early. And once I learned to read, I just read everything. So pretty quickly I read everything that was in the school, really. And there was a bunch of books that I loved. And then there was a library van that used to come round once every, I don't know, once a term, maybe 3 times a year, something like that. And I remember sitting in this library van. For those people who had a library, do you ever have a library van? Did you ever go in the library van?
I've seen them.
Just wonderful, wonderful things. And it had a carpet in it, a little step, and rows of books, and it would pull up. And I'd be looking forward to it for like weeks ahead. I'd have to say the library man's going to be like,
wow.
And then it would pull up outside the school, and I can remember there was a metal sort of railings, and you go through the gate and then into the thing, and sit on the carpet on this little step and just read these books, just sitting there. And you could choose 15, I think it was 15, and that was it. And it was so cruel, because they were like, you wanted to take all of them. It's just like, I can't have all of it. You can have 15. And it'd take me like 2 hours to choose my 15 books, and we would sort of walk out. And then they'd had for the last few months. You'd sort of read them over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I can remember one book that really became important to me and stuck in my head. And it was a book about Nelson, Horatio Nelson. And I think it might have been a Ladybird book, but that might be just a memory that I kind of attached to myself. But I remember it was full of pictures, and that these pictures were really evocative. They really did something in my head in terms of me wanting to be in that place. So I think I spent a lot of time looking at these pictures and then living them. I'd go out and shoot French soldiers out of masts, and I'd be alongside Nelson, who'd be there with his eye and his one eye and his one hand, and history became really important to me. I just started wanting to find out more and more about history. So that was my early years. That was my primary. And then when I was 11, we moved house. We moved to Kings Lynn. My dad got a job in a primary school just outside Kings Lynn. And at that time, just before we moved, they took us in. Or my dad took us into the hall. It was me and like one other boy, I think. And we sat there and did this paper. I mean, neither of us knew what this paper was, but it turned out to be 11 plus, and I failed it. I don't know whether that was inevitable or what, but it certainly at the time I had no idea what it was. So it meant when I went to Kings Lynn at 11, I went to the secondary modern. I didn't go to the grammar school. And the secondary modern had 2,000 children in it.
Wow.
And I was scared, absolutely scared stiff. It was a dangerous place. It felt dangerous. And I was completely unequipped for dealing with that kind of environment. And it felt to me completely alien, and really had a profound effect on me in terms of my experiences of education and what education might be like, and how bad it could be when it goes really bad.
Yeah, I can see what you mean about the guillotine. That's an incredible leap from being in a hamlet of like 15 kids from reception to year 6. So there's probably 2 in each year group or something, to being one of 2,000. So this is a 1970s secondary modern. Can you just paint a picture of what this school was like? That's a well, big, I suppose. That's a rubbish answer to that question, isn't it? But it was milling with people all the time. One of my abiding memories is people just milling, like I don't know, just hordes going through these spaces, and there were 2 or 3 pinch points that between the different buildings. There was the school was divided up into what was originally a girls' school and a boys' school, and then there was this kind of new block. And between these different buildings, there were these pinch spots, these sort of corridors and doorways. And my abiding memory, particularly when I first went there, was just how these people would just suddenly all converge into these really tight spots, and how crushing it was. People just getting crushed into these tight spaces. And that's how Gateway Park felt to me. It felt like a pressure cooker, a place where you were sort of pushed into and constrained, and you had no sort of choice about. And the one of the first things that happened to us was that we were brought into the school on the first morning, 350 children into a hall, and we were sat there. And then on the stage was a lectern. On the standing at this lectern was this head of year, I suppose, who just read our names out. And then we were when you were taken out into a class, and there were 14 classes. So you sort of sat there. I sat there for like 2 hours waiting for my name to be read out, and then you went out. And because at that time, as a child, I had no idea what it meant to go into a class. What would that mean? What was going to happen when I got to the classroom? What was going to happen to me? And it was so. I was so at sea, so out of my depth, and so worried all the time about what was going to happen to me, that I just kind of I was thinking about this because I knew that you were going to ask me this question. I was thinking, I never went to the toilet in 5 years. I was at that school. I never went to the toilet. Wow.
I would before I went to school, I'd be not drinking or just make sure that I didn't have anything in me that needed to come out, and then I wouldn't drink at school. I must have been so dehydrated because it was going to the toilets was terrifying.
Yeah, I remember that. I did go to the toilets, but there was always kids smoking in there, and they would have a go at you, or they'd just take the piss out of you, or just whatever. Yeah, it was a scary place to go to the toilet at school. And so when we talked about this yesterday, you sort of said that it just felt, obviously you described it as being huge, very busy, and that it was sort of out of control, and that it felt quite violent. And you also talked about dangerous teachers as well as dangerous students.
Right. So the environment was chaotic in the sense that there didn't seem to be very much control over what was happening. So it was a kind of a place where you were worried at any point that something could happen to you. And this was the student. A lot of the children were like this, but there were teachers as well. So there were teachers that would throw board rubbers at students. I was caned. There was sarcasm was used quite a lot. So it was a sort of place where you felt that you were under threat the whole time, and that fear got into you. You know, it made you hide, and you know, I can remember, you know, keeping myself away as much as I could, quiet, you know, being quiet, and that I think I would often retreat into my imagination again. You know, it was the place where you sort of go to that place where you sort of feel safe, and you just kind of just spend a lot of time in your imagination. And I felt isolated, and I'm sure that an awful lot of other children did. You know, I never had that conversation with anybody who was there at the time, but I imagine that was a common feeling amongst children who were there, that they would find their own form of escape. Another thing I did was I'd do a lot of long distance running, because it meant I could go and I got good at it. So I could, you know, that was a kind of an escape where I could go and run around the track for an hour or something, and then nobody would bother me, and I just kind of do that.
Which
so
must have added to the problems with dehydration.
It probably did. Again, it's like you think about it now, you just can't even imagine it. You know, and I never had a shower. I never went in the showers, because it was a dangerous place. So I must have smelled awful as well as dehydrated.
Probably helped to keep people at a distance.
Well, I would imagine, but it was such a formative thing for me, because it was always the thing that as a teacher, when I became a teacher, I remembered that time. I remembered what was awful about it. And it became a sort of touchstone in terms of, I don't ever want to be like that. I never want to be the kind of teacher that makes children feel fearful or upset, or because it's so easy to do that as an adult. And you know, sometimes you do it, and I you know, feel bad about it, and you think, oh yeah, you see, but you have to be, you know, you have to forgive yourself when you make mistakes. But on the other hand, the teachers that I had at secondary, a large number of them I think they felt themselves at war with us, and maybe that was a defensive thing for them as well.
Yeah, it can't have been an easy time. So having been through this sort of sorting hat experience of like the 11 plus, whether you were aware of it or not, and then there's this second sort of sorting hat process where they filter you out in the start of year 7, I presume, into all these different groups. And you spoke yesterday about how the sort of the message, the sort of the message of that school was like that you are somehow failures, that this is a place for failed kids, and there are even degrees of failure within this environment. And you also said that when you left school, you sort of felt like you were not able to do academic stuff, that you felt like you were, you know, not fit for that world.
Right. So I remember one day being in an English class, and we had an English teacher who we could see the grammar school across the field. That was the thing. There's this Edward the Eighth or Edward the Seventh kind of grammar school building, and this English teacher, I can remember, you know, these things stay with you, looking out across the field, and he said, "Oh," with a big sigh, he said, "I should be teaching over there."
Oh.
And he turned around and he looked at us and he went, "Instead, I'm working with you lot."
Wow.
That's like, that must be what, 40 years ago now, maybe longer. And that was the message. The message was, they're the clever kids. You're the thickies. You're the ones who, Do you know that I told you there were 357 kids in that first day. I went in after Easter on my last year at school, the term when we did exams, and there were less than 140 left. All of the other children that were in my year had left school by that time, without even sitting an exam. They went in, they went off and got jobs or did other things. I don't know what happened to them.
Like a industrial scale voluntary off-rolling.
yeah. And I don't know whether that was normal or what it was, but it was. I remember it just being so shocked that coming in after Easter, and there've been so few of us, and I left school with a certain belief that I wasn't clever, that I wasn't academic, that I wasn't somebody who could enter into that world or do any of those things. That's what school taught me, and that if I tried, that I'd fail, so it wasn't really worth trying.
Yes, it's so mad how many cases there are of people. In my interview with Ian Cunningham, he's in his 70s now. He's saying that he talks to people of his age who, have led really successful lives and they still feel stupid because they failed their 11 plus. I can remember Jack D talking about something similar when he was on Desert Island Discs, and he was once called an idiot or stupid or something in front of the whole school by the head teacher. And he still believes it, and he's written successful sitcoms and earned loads of money as a stand-up comedian and written novels and what have you, and he still feels that in his core he still believes that head teacher was right. It's just incredible the power that branding children as failures has for the rest of their lives. And it just goes against everything that we know about child development. That people develop in different ways at different times. There are so many examples of people who've been told that they won't amount to anything. And for some people that serves as a catalyst and they think, right, I'll bloody prove you wrong. And for other people, they just internalize it and they go, yeah, you're right, that's me. So okay, so you had this bruising experience, secondary school. What happened next?
Well, next I was 5 years on the dole. This is early 80s. I came out of school in 1980, 1981, and I spent 5 years on the dole and drifting, really. Ended up in London for a bit, and in a squat in Norwich, quite a famous squat called Argyle Street, which people can look up on the internet, which was like a street of squatters.
All right.
It's quite exciting, also quite dangerous. And just lost my way. Didn't really know what I was doing. I had no kind of path. I can remember my dad. I went to stay for the weekend with my dad, and he drove me back to the Argyle Street, and we sat in the car together. And he looked around and he went, "Oh, Tim, you can come home anytime you want." I think he must have been really worried about me.
Yeah, I bet.
I just kind of said, "Well, I don't think I'll be living here for much longer. I'm sure, I'll work a way out of this." And then I don't know quite how it happened, but I just started thinking to myself, "Look, this isn't, what was I, 20, maybe 19, 20, something like that." And I just think to myself, this is not how I want to go. This isn't really the story that I see my life becoming. There are a lot of people on that street who done far too many things that they shouldn't do to themselves, and a bit of a wreck, really. And I didn't want to become that. And I started spending more and more time in the library and going back to sort of looking at history books, really. And I remember reading a lot of these books again and finding out other things about history and other stuff. And I thought, I think I might go and study a course at the college. So I enrolled at the college in Norwich and did a couple of A-levels. and managed to get myself into the university. And that's where I studied history and philosophy. And it wasn't really until I got to university and I started being in classes with other people and realizing, actually, I'm not out of my depth here. I actually can sort of hold my own, and these things are not beyond me. And I can write a decent essay, and I can, and I was interested in ideas. Ideas were really something that really became important to me, and as all the way through my teaching. And so philosophy was something that I really spent an awful lot of time reading and thinking about. So it was at that kind of point really that I started to realise perhaps I wasn't as stupid as I'd been led to believe.
Yeah.
And that was on my way out, really.
Yeah, so it's like you retreated to what you knew from your experience at primary school, which was like the library is a place where I feel safe and where I'm interested in stuff, and it seems like that was the place that was able to sort of act as a mechanism in some way to get you on a different path. And so you were talking about philosophy there, and the nature of philosophy is that it's about inquiry, isn't it? It's about asking questions. It's about not accepting things, identifying assumptions, and so on. And I know that became very sort of central to your work as a teacher quite early on as well. So talk me through that, and then let's talk about. So you met Luke Abbott quite early on in your teaching career, in your first term, was it?
Right. Yeah. So something really remarkable happened, and I just absolutely stroke of luck. Two things really. One was that the first school that I got a job in Norwich, was because I did my PGCE in Norwich, was working doing my last teaching practice, and got a job in Tuxwood. And the head teacher there was somebody called Sue Eagle. And it was just an absolute stroke of luck. It was the first job I applied for, had the interview, got the job, didn't know anything about Sue, started working in September. And Sue was a new head, and she turned out to be somebody who was really, really interested in philosophy for children, and had seen, as well as seeing Luke Abbott at a conference. And she got Luke to come in and work in the school in the very first term I was there. And I think back and I think that was 1,000,000 to 1 chance. I could have been working anywhere and never come across these ideas. And I came across them as an NQT in my first term. So Luke came in and worked with my class, and I'd been teaching them for a few weeks, and they were hard work. They were year 2, so 6 or 7-year-olds, and they were really difficult to engage. Well, they were for me anyway. And Luke came in, sat with them in the hall, and started talking to them about this village where the houses had disappeared into this giant hole, and they needed rescuing. And with the children, this is a story. He told them this is a story. He said, "Would you be interested in being the people doing the rescuing?" And my class went, "Yeah, we'll have some of that." And then for the next hour, there he was, completely immersed in this story. I was somebody who needed rescuing. I had this, you see this giant hole, and this big lump of wood was across my legs, and I can remember all kneeling on the floor, a few feet away from me, controlling these imaginary kind of robots that were coming to sort of rescue me, and looking at them and thinking, I've got to learn how to do this. I've got to learn how to do what this bloke Luke's doing, because this is what I want to do as a teacher. And it connected with all the things that I'd been interested in throughout my life. It was imaginary, it was story-led. I spent an awful lot of time doing role-play gaming, and that this seemed to relate very closely to that. And it was inquiry-based, because it was always about, you talked earlier about the workshop that you saw me teach at Northern Rocks. It's about inquiry. That's always about inquiry. It's always asking questions. It asks the kinds of questions that are immediately in front of you. So what's the best way of rescuing this person? How can we do it without putting our own lives at risk? How long have we got? what do we need to know in order to help him once we release him from underneath the wood? So there's those questions, but there's also the big philosophical questions I realized, which are about what is it to be the kinds of people that are prepared to do things for others. What does it mean to serve other people? What does it mean to be, like I always think of 9/11, as people were rushing out of the building, there were all these firefighters that were rushing in. What was their motivation? What kind of people would do something like that? And those are the things that I found myself talking to the children about. We were doing it in philosophy with children, but we were also started doing it in this other work as well. So I was just lucky, James. I just got really, really lucky, and that was both of those things turned out to be things that I was already very interested in, and I realised at that point that I could bring them into the classroom and learn how to do them, and they could be the context for the teaching that I was doing.
And so I know that you were introduced to Dorothy Heathcote through Luke, but I think it was mainly with Luke that you developed this, and it sounds like you almost had a kind of apprenticeship where you were working with him over a number of years and really sort of pulling this idea of mantle apart and imaginative inquiry and figuring out how it works and how it sometimes doesn't work.
Yeah, so when this was 1995, I think that was the first year that I started teaching, and it wasn't something that was being used in school. Luke had studied with Dorothy Heathcote in the 80s at Newcastle University, and he was an advisor at that time, and he was going around working in schools, but nobody really picked it up in schools. And the reason for that was that it was kind of the way that you learned how to do it at that time was a kind of the kindest way of saying it was osmosis. You kind of watched someone like Luke, who was a terrifically skilled practitioner who'd learned how to do it over many years of practice and working with someone like Dorothy Heathcote. And then someone like me had to sort of learn from watching him and then applying it in my classroom. And there wasn't really much of a structure for this or a vocabulary for it. So one of the things that I did was that because I became obsessed with it, was that I would spend an awful lot of time corresponding with Luke. This is, write to him, and then we were emailing, and then I was phoning him, and I was saying, look, explain to me how I do this, and this went wrong, and this went right. And over the years, we started to, he mentored me, and we started to begin to pick this apart and to find a way of explaining this, what was going on, and so that it became more transparent. And as I said earlier about this best practice research scholarship, so I got some money to do this in the late 90s. And that was a big step forward, because it meant that I could work with Luke, and it was funded. And then after we had a successful Ofsted inspection in the late 90s, and they saw Mantle the Expert, and we got some funding from the government through the Innovations Unit, and that allowed us Luke and I, to design a program where we started teaching we've got a program where we could work with other teachers to see whether this approach could be taught to other people. So that kind of process that I went through, as well as being a teacher, became really an important part of my sort of professional life, really, and has remained so.
Yes, I know you're very involved. So you wrote the book about it, and then you now run training programs and residentials for teachers, don't you?
Yes. So out of that original funded program, we started doing weekends and other training programs at a place called Ringsfield Hall, a residential place. And over the years, that became somewhere where people from all over the world started coming. And then we created the website, and then I started publishing all these things. That was another kind of thing, I think, that going back to our conversation around blogging, was that around that time, or in the 2000s, it became much easier to publish this material that had been around, but it tended to be in print form and not really available to a wider audience. So I started, scanning these things, or copying them out and then publishing them and all sorts of other things, and writing stuff of my own, and then other people started writing things. So over that time, it developed into a community of practice, where people came for training, but also became people that were contributing their own ideas.
Yeah. Okay, so can you try to explain like what Mantle of the Expert is for people who aren't familiar with it? And I don't know whether it would be simplest to sort of to maybe use a worked example of a sort of as a project, and how you would start it. I know that yesterday you talked about the examples. I think it was one of the first ones that you did about the Normans and a castle in Norwich, but that was one of your first ones. Maybe there's another example that you think, okay, this is a really good way to just introduce people to this idea so that they can grasp it in just a few minutes.
Yeah, so it's about, as I talked earlier about with the Egyptian tomb, it's about creating an imaginary context. So the idea is that there's something that's happening in this imaginary world, and the children in the world can represent different points of view. And one of the points of view, the main one, if you like, is the point of view of people who have expertise. Now, there's a paradox in it, because it's called Mantle of the Expert. That's the metaphor, is mantle of the expert. They're not experts. People sometimes, probably very understandably, misunderstand it, that somehow we're pretending that the kids are experts. They're not experts. They don't know any more about history than they did when you introduced the story. You have to teach them about the history. But the mantle bit is to do with responsibility. So one of the very first contexts that I developed using this approach, when I was still very, very much at the start of understanding how it worked, was the idea of a castle. So in our topic, which we used to organise things by topics, I was doing castles. Now, there's a Norman castle in Norwich, very famous one on a hill, and it was built by William Rufus, who was William the Conqueror's son, William II. And I thought, well, what about if I did this as a Mantle of the Expert? Now, to do it as Mantle of the Expert, the children have to be inside the fiction as if they're people with expertise. Well, the expertise that I decided for them was people who were building the castle. So I introduced this idea to them and said, well, I was just wondering what it must have been like for the people that built the castle. I mean, how do you go about building a castle? It's such a big building, isn't it? Do you know that the stone comes all the way from France? So they had this massive problem. Not only did they build, and also the hill that it's on. Do you know that's not even a real hill? They built that as well. I mean, how do you go about doing that? How long did it take, do you suppose? And of course, the kids were like, "Oh yeah, that's inquiry, isn't it? That's immediately there's an inquiry question there, and they want to find out more." So I started working with them in this context. Now that context has three important defining elements. The first is the one that we talked about earlier, which is a responsible team. So if you're the responsible team building a castle for a king at that period in history, the most important responsibility is that it's safe, that it works as a castle and keeps people out, and that the people who are living in it feel safe. And of course, this is a hostile environment because the Normans have just invaded. There's a rebellion going on up in the north, and these castles are built to keep the Normans safe and to intimidate the local people, the Anglo-Saxons. And that's the stuff that I want the children to begin to understand, so that they learn all the things about that period of history, but they also begin to develop an understanding of that concept, that idea of invasion and subjugation and ruling and power and all those other things. So there's their responsibility as the team, is to build this castle and make it safe. Now, the second element is the client. That is somebody that they're working for. Well, the client here is this king, William. Now, he's a powerful client, the most powerful you can get. So he's somebody that you have to be careful with. So if you're writing to him, for example, because he only visits the site very occasionally. Most of the time, he's out around the country fighting wars or doing other things. So we have to spend a lot. We have to tell him what's going on. We write to him. Now, if you're writing to a king, then you have to be careful about the way that you do it. You have to be careful about the language that you use. You have to be careful about your spelling and your punctuation and all those other things. And your handwriting has to be legible. So all those things start to become meaningful for the children, as we were talking earlier. They can see the purpose of it and the reason why you want to take care over those things. And the third element is the commission. That's the job that we're working on. And the job is building this castle. Now, my job, my role as the teacher in this is to organise that and look at the curriculum and say, well, how much of this curriculum can I teach through this context? So I might look at it by subject. So I could think of probably all the different kind of writing. So if you think about writing for that age group, you've got instruction writing, signs, letters, reports, maybe descriptions. Those are 5 different kinds of writing. Well, I could do all that in the context. Maths. Well, I'll be teaching maths discreetly because we do a maths lesson every day, and I'll be teaching them about all the kinds of things that children at that age need to do maths. But I can use and apply it, can't I? Because building a castle involves all kinds of maths. Science. Well, there's all kinds of stuff about materials. I could teach all that through this, couldn't I? Do you see what I mean? And then art. Well, the king's going to want images of what the castle's going to look like when it's built, or maybe he wants a particular image of a particular part of the castle. Maybe he wants a tapestry commissioned to go on the wall of his bedroom. Perhaps we could design that. So do you see what I mean? It's quite easy once you get the context, and once you get the children engaged in the context. That's the key. Then you can start teaching lots of the curriculum through the context. Not all of it. That's a mistake that some people make, and it's a very understandable one, is they think that this mantle of the expert thing is about teaching everything all the time. It's really not. As a teacher, you pick and choose. So I never taught maths lessons using mantle of the expert. I used and applied maths all the time, but I didn't. I was still teaching discrete maths lessons. And the other thing is, the last thing to make very clear is that the fiction isn't like a fiction where you step into it like a scenario and then you spend all your time imagining that you're. So as the children come into the classroom, you're not standing there going, "Oh, good morning to all of you builders. Come in and sit down and we'll start talking about today's business." You don't do that. It's not that kind of thing. It's much more like play than it is like a kind of simulation. So in play, when you watch children play, they come in and out of the play world, and they spend time in the play world, and then they'll come out of the play world and they'll talk about what's going on in the play world, and they'll go back in again. And for them, that moving in and out is a perfectly natural thing to do. For adults, it's much more difficult, but because they think it's much more complicated than it really is, they kind of imagine it's once you start the drama, if you stop it or tell them it's not real, then it'll destroy the magic. But it doesn't. So I'll give you an example. If we want to talk to the king, so the king's going to come and visit the castle, the building site. That's what we want to. So we're preparing for that visit, which obviously that's a big event, because the king's going to come. So we need to be ready to explain to the king all the things about what's going on with the building site. We need to show him our pictures and get everything ready and talk to him about. He might ask questions about the laying of the bricks, for example, or the dimensions and all kinds of other things. So we need to be ready for that. Now, to do that, sounds like that might take a really complicated, but it's just simple. So I'll just say to them, I'll tell you what, for this bit of what we're doing, I'll be the king. It's like, okay, well, you'd be the king then. Okay. So, what kind of king are we talking about here? You know, what do you know about William Rufus? So that's an inquiry question, isn't it? So they start talking about him, and I say, okay, well, let me see. Let's see how kings sit. How do you suppose William Rufus would sit? Let's all be the king for a bit. And then they all kind of give us an idea of, you know, I'm sitting with my back straight and my arms folded, you know, and my chin up, you know, sort of. That's how a king would sit, right? Or I might be a king who sits with his legs astride and his hands on his knees, you know, where we start talking about that. Now, where are we? Are we inside the imaginary world, or are we inside the real world? Well, we're in neither. We're in this twilight where we're creating the idea of a king, and we're doing it through dialogue. And we're all representing the king. There isn't somebody who's, you know, being the king and then everybody has to kind of go along with it. And then you say, okay, so are we ready then? Should we start? Okay, so I'll be the king, and I'm going to sit like this with my hands on my knees, and I've got a big throne. You can imagine all the, you know, I'm wearing a big fur or something like that and a crown. And you're going to come in as the builders, and you're going to tell me about how the plans are going. Is that all right? So they're like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Okay, so when you come in, how are you going to greet this king? Now, can you see how much time are we actually spending inside the imaginary world? Almost all of it is negotiated. Almost all of it is about deciding and talking, inquiring into what that world would be like and what we're going to be doing in that world. And that's the thing, is it's Mantle the Expert is that stepping in and out of the imaginary world. It's not about simulations and all pretending that we're builders.
Yeah. It does sound like I can sort of see why it's going to be so useful. It seems like it's a way to create a context in which, for example, you were talking about writing a letter to the king, and
Yeah.
you know, if you start a lesson by saying, "Today, children, we're going to talk about, you know, how to write a letter," and you know, you go either "Dear Sir" or "Madam" at the top, and you put your address there, and you sort of, and it's just about writing a letter. It's sort of a bit boring. But if you're talking about how to write a letter to the king and that they're involved in this thing, it seems like it's a way to manufacture. I don't know if manufacture is the right word, but to create intrinsic motivation that they want to write the best letter that they can write, because you know they're writing to the king, and that helps to raise their game in terms of the quality of their writing. Is that sort of essentially in terms of like a rationale for this? Is that close to capturing it?
Well, I think it comes down to what we mean by intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So, why should the children want to write a letter? Why should they? Why should any of us want to write a letter? You know, I'd only really write a letter if there was something in it for me. You know, if I was writing a letter, I mean, I don't write letters anymore, but emails or whatever. But I'd write something if there was something I was going to get out of it. Yeah. So why should I want to write a letter? What would be my motivation? So it comes back to what we were saying earlier, that it could be an extrinsic motivation. Well, you know, you get a sticker, or you know, you get a nice comment from the teacher, or you know, writing letters is something that you'll find very helpful when you're at some point in your life. Now, what Mantle the Expert does is it says to us, well, let's take that question seriously. Let's say, well, what is it that would make it would motivate us? Now, concern, being bothered, is something that motivates us. If you're bothered about something, if you're bothered about communicating something clearly and making it what you're doing is important to you, you're invested in it, then it starts making sense. You know, if we're writing to the king. Now, if you just do it as an academic exercise, you say, "Oh, I wonder what it would be like if we wrote to a king." Then I'm not bothered in that. I understand straight away that's just an exercise. That's just like I'm not invested in it. It's just an activity. Whereas if I've invested my time in something, as you know, in this project, and I've spent time thinking about it, and we've involved ourselves in this story, then writing to the king and letting and making it something to him that communicates what we've done is important to me. So writing it in such a way that he'll read it and be able to understand it, and he won't be put off by this, you know, the terrible handwriting or the spelling or not writing complete sentences and all that sort of stuff, because it's all about communicating meaning. Then writing a letter becomes something that seems almost obvious. Of course, that's what we're going to do.
Has there been research done on this? Like, is there any way to sort of point to evidence that children, you know, produce better writing when it's sort of contextualized in this way?
I don't know. It's Mantle of the Expert is very under researched, very under researched. There's an application that's in process at the moment from Newcastle University that's actually this week gone off to the funding body, and they're waiting to hear back to see whether that's successful or not. But the kinds of stuff that we're talking about here, I don't think it is very. I've not heard of any research in it, and it's something I think that it needs research. It needs looking at. For me, and for Luke and for Dorothy Heathcote, it's always been about practice. So it's you see it working through practice. You do it with children, and you see the difference it makes.
Yeah, and that's. I mean, I'm not saying that research evidence is the only way to judge whether something's good or not. We do loads of things all the time that there's no evidence for. Assemblies are quite weird, aren't they? Like, what's the evidence for assemblies? We don't really see people, you know, taking to the streets with pitchforks to get rid of assemblies. But it would be interesting to just find out, you know, what is going on in a Mantle classroom, and how is it different to other kinds of classrooms. And there is this thing about the language of it. I know you were talking about the problem with the word expert that's often sort of misunderstood, but I'm not really sure about the word mantle either. Like, I just looked it up, and there's I know the definition of, like, you know, the big swirling mass of like molten lava, the sort of layer beneath the Earth's crust, and then there's two other definitions. One of them is like a loose sleeveless cloak or cape, and the other one is the responsibilities of an important position or job, like the mantle of the presidency, for example. I'm assuming that it's sort of that last one, is it? That it's like this taking, it's almost like a metaphorical cape that you're sort of putting on these clothes of. And I know that you use the language of imaginative inquiry, and I think that that seems to me to come closer to capturing what it is that you're doing here.
Yeah. So the name itself was invented by Dorothy Heathcote, and she was thinking metaphorically. And it is problematic because it's one of those names that if you don't know what it means by the name, whereas imaginative inquiry kind of says what it is, whereas Mantle of the Expert doesn't really tell you what it is. You have to understand the metaphor in order to appreciate what it means. And it has been a problem in the past. I think it's becoming less of a problem now because I think people, certainly in education, know a bit more about it. But yes, it's from the idea of taking on a mantle of responsibility. Now, in a literal sense, if you think about the way that somebody, if you take on an important job, for example, I mean, let's say the head of the royal family, you know, the head of the state, when they're dressed in the appropriate robes and clothes of that position. You take somebody who's, well, when you get a degree, you dress in a particular way, and it's a sign that you are somebody who has achieved a certain position. The thing about the mantle of an expert is that position has a responsibility, that you are, by being an expert, you are in some way responsible for that field of expertise. So when you become a teacher, you take on the mantle of being a teacher. You become responsible for the students in your class, for their academic progress, for their happiness, for their social well-being, for their safety when they're in your care. That's your mantle. And that's the mantle of being an expert. Now, in children's life, children tend not to, in real life, have much responsibility. Their responsibility really is to sort of do what they're told, kind of get on and work hard and, do what adults tell them, really. And in the fictional world, they can take on the mantle of being adults with expertise. And it's a way, it's not to get too theoretical about this, but this is framing theory. This is Goffman, is that we frame the world through our way that we interact with the world and through the context that we're in. So we're, for example, I'm a dad, I'm a teacher, I'm a football fan, a friend of whatever. And in different contexts, I'll behave in slightly different ways. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm different. It just means that I'm framing that context in a different way. Now, if your context, if the only way that you have to frame the world, or the only context you're in, is to do as you're told and to be the one who doesn't know, the idea of the empty vessel, and that the teacher's the one who knows, and you defer to the teacher as the adult and the most powerful person in the room, then how do you get to practice what it's like to be the one who's responsible, the one who's in charge, the one who's making decisions? How do you get to practice that? Now, in Mantle of the Expert, it creates a safe space, a safe world, an imaginary world, because nobody's going to get hurt. So if we're, for example, rescuing people that are stuck on the side of a mountain, say a climber or something, you never send children up to rescue somebody who's stuck on the side, because they'd all die, and so would the person who's trying to rescue. But in an imaginary world, you can do that, and they can take on that mantle of expertise, and they can, through their imagination, they can experience what it's like to be people with responsibility and power. So in terms of this framing theory, it gives them the opportunity to frame the world in different ways, because you can, in through drama and this imaginative inquiry, you could take on the point of view of different people, and you can frame the same context in different ways. So, for example, in looking at the Norman castle, the expert frame is the builders, but you can also take the point of view of the Anglo-Saxon people who live in Norwich and are watching the castle being built. And you could say to them, I wonder what it was like for those people. Their lives were totally changed by that event, 1066, by the Battle of Hastings, and these people turning up. And I wonder how some of them respond. I wondered how they responded. I guess they responded in different ways. I mean, how would you respond? Would you stand up and fight, even though you knew it was a desperate fight? Or would you go along? Would you go and see if you could maybe get a job? Maybe you join them. How would you do it? And then that, do you see what I mean? It's that being able to experience the world through different points of view. That's what this enables.
Yes, and it seems to me that it's something that's very clearly linked to history in your work. I don't think it's probably exclusive to history. You could look at, for example, the miners who were stuck down the mine in Chile or whatever it might be, current affairs type stuff. It's a way of... I can see the value in it, and on a number of levels, really, from a teacher's perspective, just from a pedagogy perspective. Like, to go right back to the start, you were struggling to teach this class of year twos, and somebody comes in and just with a few sentences can create this world that the children, and like they know that it's not real. It's like they're able to suspend their disbelief and just enter into this thing, and it sort of just makes something more exciting. And I can imagine why it would be more pleasant for a young person to be in that classroom. It's something that I would want for my child, for them to be in that world where they're being helped to imagine what it's like. And I imagine as well that it's developing empathy, which is one aspect that I think would be really interesting to research. I know that we spoke a little while ago about doing some research around this, didn't we? It didn't quite come off, but I think that that there's something to be said for developing empathy. If you glance at the world's news media, on any given day, would suggest that we could do with a little bit more help in sort of helping to understand one another and what it's like to live in other people's shoes.
Well, yeah, again, it comes back to this framing idea. If your only experience of school, the only frame that you experience education through, is the frame of being a student, and with the teacher being the one who is instructing you and looking at their various resources, where does empathy fit into that kind of education? Where is the opportunity to look at the world through other points of view? Drama's great at this. Drama's very powerful at this, at creating a medium for that kind of education, where you can step into those kinds of worlds very straightforwardly, and just imagine it. And you're not trying to. This is the thing. Is it like I remember reading a criticism of this kind of idea that, well, you can't really know what it's like. You can't know what it's like. So let's take the example of the miners that were trapped down the mine in Chile. They were down there for several weeks, I think, weren't they? And the whole world was focused on that. And you might say to the children, I wonder what it was like for the families. I wonder what it was like for them, night after night, day after day. What would they do? Now, I've never been in that position. I've never anything like something as like that. But I can use my imagination, and I can start to imagine what I would do and how I would react in that situation. Now, the more I know about it, the more I know about the circumstances, the more I know about what was happening and why they were trapped and what people were doing to bring them out. The more I can appreciate what might have been going through their minds, and the more I'm interested I am in that, and it becomes, I think, it's something that human beings do anyway. I mean, I think people already put themselves into the shoes of other people, but it's not something that we do explicitly in education. I mean, every time you watch a film or read a book or go to the theatre, you're being framed. You're seeing this world that's been depicted through another point of view. It's not your point of view, and nobody kind of explains it. But that's what's going on. But we don't really use that very much in education. We tend to sort of ignore that world and don't see it as being part of an educational opportunity. And that was the thing that Dorothy Heathcote said, was that theatre, she came from theatre can be used. That way of operating can be used in the classroom. It can be a very productive form of educational medium.
Okay, I've got one more question on Mantle, and then we'll move on. It's a question about scalability and about how, like what's been your experience of working with these other teachers to help develop these practices? Because sometimes I wonder if I see somebody who's really gifted at creating these sort of alternative worlds and who's very gifted at that kind of inquiry-based practice, it seems like it's quite a sophisticated set of skills that's being used. And I wonder to what extent is this scalable? And I have no idea about this because, I'm completely outside it. But what's been your sense from having run these residentials? And I imagine that you stay in touch with teachers, like how many of them stick with it? How many of them, really take it into new places? And how many of them sort of try it and go, oh, actually, like, I don't know if I can really make this work?
I think if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, I think I probably would have come up with quite a depressing answer and said that not many, that it seemed to be something that people might engage with initially very enthusiastically, and then it wouldn't be something that they would stick with for very long. There weren't really very many examples of people, teachers or schools, that were really kept going. It was something that not that they weren't invested in it, I think they were, but it turned out to be more difficult than perhaps they'd imagined, or it wasn't quite working in the way that they'd hoped. And there were lots of things that needed to be understood. And Luke and I were very aware of this. In our early sort of experiments working with teachers, we had a high dropout rate. Lots of teachers didn't complete the courses or used it for a bit, and then when we got back in touch with them a year or two later, they sort of, if they were honest, they sort of said, "Oh, we're not really using it anymore." And that became quite a frustration for us. And we did think for a while, I think, that that might be an unsolvable problem, that might be something that we just have to accept, that perhaps this was only going to be for a very, very tiny number of people. But I wouldn't say that now. I think we've become much clearer about what's involved, what can be taught and in what kind of order, how ideas, concepts within Mantle the Expert can be introduced. The fact that I think the book that I wrote, which was an amalgamation of the work that Luke and I had done over 15 years, has helped a great deal. I think it, not to sort of blow my own trumpet, but I think it was needed. It was desperately needed because it meant that people could buy the book. They didn't have to do the courses necessarily, but the book was a guide they could go back to, and it could help them out. And it's the sort of things that we'd found that people struggled with. They had answers that they could find in the book, and that could get them over those hurdles. So, to answer your question, nowadays the community, if we can call it that, has grown so large that I really don't know the vast majority of people that they're actually using it. Occasionally people get in contact with me that I've never heard of. I've never had any contact with them at all, and say, "Oh, I've been using Mantle the Expert, and I've got this idea. What do you think of it?" Or could you, what do you think of this? Or or anything. Just, or I'm interested in coming on one of your courses, or I've moved schools recently. I've been using Mantle for years, and the head teacher wants me to introduce it to the new school. Can you help? And so I really don't have an answer anymore. One thing I do know is that it has a life of its own. It's now out of my hands. It's not something that I'm entirely responsible for anymore.
And so has this community, this sort of movement, if you want to call it that, this growing community of practice, has that come out of the work that you and Luke have done primarily, and the book that you published, or are there other people who are sort of banging this drum as well?
Yeah, it's not a movement, I don't think. I mean, I think it's not to quibble about words or anything, but it's not got an agenda. I think movements have an agenda, wouldn't you say? Is that fair?
Okay, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I sort of think of learning to learn as a kind of movement, and maybe learning to learn does have more of an explicit agenda. It's trying to teach kids how to get better at learning stuff. But I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of a loose word to use. What would you call it?
An approach. I think it's an approach. I think that's the word that I'm most comfortable with anyway.
I suppose so. There's an approach, but then it's always been an approach. It's been an approach since before you came across it. But now there's the growing number of people. That's why I refer to it as a movement, or a sort of an increasingly, let's call it an increasingly popular approach.
Okay.
Has this come from your work primarily, or are there other people who have been leading the charge, as it were? Not leading the charge.
Exactly. See how the metaphor takes
it's this Nelson thing. I want to suck it to the French. I just want to take them all on.
Yeah. So this is why I'm so pernickety about these metaphors, because it's not like that. if you frame it that way, if you frame it as a kind of something where we're all sort of flying the flag and taking it on, and it's never been that for me. For me, it's always been much more. Let's think of what the word would be. Much more nerdy. I'm a nerd. You know, it's like saying when Gary Gygax was writing the rules to Dungeons and Dragons. You know, was that a movement? Did he have some kind of? Was he flying a flag? Was he taking on, you know, the world of pre-role play games? And he wasn't. It was just him and a bunch of other people were just interested in developing that idea. And that's all it's really been for me, in the sense of Mantle the Expert is an idea and it's an approach. And if it ends up being something more, then that's not because that was the intention. It wasn't meant to revolutionize education or transform the way that everybody works. It's not really.
I get it. But what I'm asking is, has this increasing popularity, has that come from your work?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I can answer that, and honestly, although it does feel a bit again like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but yes, I mean, from Luke more than me, I would say. Luke kept the flame burning, and then I, in collaboration with Luke, so our work together, I would say, it's not really something that exists, or it does now, but it didn't exist initially outside of a very small number of people.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's not something to be worn lightly. You know, that's quite some achievement. If you've taken this approach and you've shed some light on it and you've developed it over 25 years, is it, that you've been working with Luke, and it's now at the point where other people are taking it and running with it, and this increasing popularity has got to the point where you don't even know everybody who's in this. It seems like you've achieved something quite spectacular there. It might feel quite a modest achievement, but from my perspective, that seems like it's quite something.
Yeah. Again, it's one of the things that you're kind of. I suppose it's like anything that you work on very closely. It's you don't really ever sort of step back and look at it like that. You just kind of you're sort of in the moment. And all the things that we've done are things that, there have been times when we've sort of thought, oh, this isn't going to work. This is going to, people won't engage with this, or after a bit, it will lose energy and lose momentum. And, there are various times when that's felt like that. And so looking at it now and the size of it, I suppose is, yeah, that's true.
Let's zoom out now and think about rethinking education more widely. You've been talking about rethinking education in terms of your own practice, and also, this approach of Mantle of the Expert. I want to focus on three sort of areas in this part of the conversation. Really, essentially, the first one is positives. Like, what do you see that's happening out there in the education system that you would like to see more of? Because when we talk about rethinking education, I think sometimes there's a tendency to focus on the negatives, and that's important. There's no shortage of problems and challenges that we face, but there's also loads of good stuff. So let's start by pointing at sort of 2 or 3 examples of really positive practice that you think is great. And then we'll come on to some of the challenges and the problems that we see. And then we'll finish, if we can, by seeing if we can fix those problems. And we'll try and be nice and solution focused. Okay, so positives, first of all. What do you see out there that you would like to see more of?
The thing that always gives me hope in education is people. Is that I think that people who come into education, and I'm talking like the vast number of people, I mean, I don't know what the percentage would be, 99.9% of anybody who becomes a teacher comes in because they want to be a teacher. They want to work in the world of education. They want to work with children, and they want to find the best ways that they can to do the best job that they can. sometimes we end up doing the wrong things, but I think people always have the right motivations. I think sometimes we end up maybe doing things that aren't necessarily in children's interests. But I think that that's not done because we're motivated badly. I think it's because we make mistakes. We're human, or we have a partial understanding. I think that's true of all of us. We don't have a complete understanding of what it is to educate the human mind, and we're all working towards that understanding, which will never be achieved entirely. So I think that gives me enormous hope, and I think that if it didn't have that hope, if it didn't have the hope that things were moving and progressing, and that there wasn't, an awful lot of good things happening in education, I think I would have left teaching a long, long time ago. And maybe it comes back to that opportunity, that very lucky opportunity that I had, that I ended up meeting Sue Eagle and Luke Abbott and getting the chance to work on things that stimulated me and made me feel like what I was doing was in line with my values. I think it must be very difficult this has happened to me a couple of times when I've ended up working in a school which has had a change of head, and I've left within a few short weeks, actually, simply because it was very clear from the start that they were taking the school in a different direction to me. And I think that's a very hard thing if you're a teacher and you've got a set of, we've always got a set of values, and then the values of the school are no longer aligned with you. And I think an awful lot of teachers end up leaving the profession because they just become very unhappy. They feel that it doesn't meet their identity anymore. So coming back to, in terms of people, then I think that people and the community of practice, or communities of practice that exist in education, and that they have, I think it feels to me anyway, and that those things have grown a lot recently over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by communities of practice in education?
Well, the mantle of the expert community is the example of a community of practice that I'm obviously most involved in.
Yeah.
Something like Research Ed, which is much bigger and wider ranging community of practice, which has a much more diverse base and is a movement. I think has an agenda and people that are involved in driving that agenda. But I think it is a grassroots movement. It is not top down. I think that's the difference that I make between a community of practice and something which comes from above. So I've never seen anything. I'm now kind of just being careful about what I say, because I'm trying to think if there are examples of this, but I can't think of anything that's come as a strategy that's been kind of funded and promoted and imposed often by government that's ever really been successful.
Yeah, it is definitely hard to think of examples, and one that's often cited is assessment for learning, which is something that ended up with a sort of a happy ending, if you like, in that the recent trials that have been done of the embedded formative assessment approach have found that this approach yields benefits for kids. But when Dylan, William and Paul Black published Inside the Black Box back in, I think it was 1998, they ended that with a sort of a call for government to get involved, to say this is the best bet that we have for improving young people's educational outcomes. Let's get government backing, and the government did back it with lots of fanfare and funding and training programs and so on. And it just sort of, I totally agree with you. There's something about top-down implementation that just doesn't work. Even when it's a really good idea, like assessment for learning, the top-down pressure, it sort of turns into an accountability fest, and it just sort of, it mutates and becomes something that it wasn't when it was at its outset. And that's a massive problem, because top-down implementation is our go-to model. Like, it's the whole basis of government. It's the whole basis of sort of devolution. Even when you devolve something, you're still devolving it to a lower level of top-down organization. And even classrooms themselves are sort of quite top-down in the way that they're led by teachers. And I'm not saying that there's no need for leadership. I'm not saying there's no need for teachers or for school leaders or for government ministers, but there are other ways of working. At the moment, I'm really invested in this new sort of field of study called implementation science, which I've been working with schools, and it's not like bottom up, but it's not top down either. It's like working with all levels throughout the organisation to implement change, and it seems to me to be the way to go. So I totally share with you your reservations about top down change. It seems to just be a bad idea.
Once, a few years ago, I was in Finland to an event out there, educational event, and one evening we were invited to a restaurant, and all the people that were presenting, me included, went to this restaurant. So there were about 50 educators from all over the world. It was a kind of an international thing. And on the agenda for the evening, the Minister of Education was going to speak. He was going to do a keynote, I suppose, but it wasn't a kind of informal thing. So we were sat in this restaurant, and there was a bunch of people. We were talking, the way you do. How are you? I'm Tim, and where do you come from, and all the rest of it. And there was a guy who was sitting opposite me, scruffy guy, sort of a bit unshaven, casual clothes, and all the rest of it. And I was talking to him for a bit. And anyway, so we got to the end of the meal, and the person who was organising the conference stood up and said, "Oh, we've got now the Minister of Education from Finland who's going to talk to us." And this scruffy guy who'd been sat opposite me stood up, and I was like, "Well, not what I'd expected." And he said the thing that stuck most in my mind was, he said, "I don't see my job as telling teachers what to do. So I see my job as doing what I can to make the mechanics work as best they can, and to keep out of their way when it comes to pedagogy." He said that's a conversation for professionals. That's not a conversation for politicians. He said, "I'm a politician. I'm not a teacher. I'm not involved in that world. I don't know. I wouldn't have a voice in that world." And education is one of those things where politicians really feel entitled to have a say in things that they really are not qualified to talk about. And every time they do, they really just sound like idiots. They really sound like they're really either they're sort of pushing an agenda that they know very little about, or they say things that they kind of get themselves, like recently the Labour Shadow Minister for Education was interviewed by the TES. I don't know if you, can't remember her name now, but she was interviewed by the TES, and
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and she just I think she was probably just speaking sincerely as somebody who has thought a little bit about teaching but not very much, and ended up saying a whole bunch of stuff which really annoyed a certain section of edu-Twitter. And I don't think she probably had any clue that she was doing that. It probably sounded almost, like to her, like an innocent thing to say.
Yeah, she was saying stuff like, "I'm not into facts and knowledge," wasn't it? And that I'm more into like dialogue and collaboration or some group work. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, really? Don't just.
Yeah, you're sort of watching it through your fingers, aren't you? Thinking like they're just making the same mistakes over and over again.
But it's not. But the point thing is that what's it to do with her? It's like the Minister of Health saying, "Oh, I'm more into chemotherapy than I'm into radiotherapy," or "I'm more into, I don't know, some kind of thing that I don't know anything about." It's like, it's none of your business. You're a politician. Make sure the system runs work, that schools are properly funded, and that all the things that are to do with the way that politicians should be involved in schools, and don't get involved in what goes on in the classroom. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. And there's a place for all of this stuff. It's like it's just so depressing when people say I'm against this and I'm for this, and you're like, oh my goodness, like there's good reasons why we want to teach kids knowledge and facts.
Right,
And there are also good reasons why we sometimes want to do group work so that they can learn how to get along with one another
right.
and interact and develop interpersonal skills and oracy skills and all of that stuff. And many of these ideas have a place and they can be used well or badly. And like you say, these are professional matters that are just A, none of your business, but B, it's not binary. Like it's just such a stupid binary position to take. Like, okay, just to take a breath, we've clearly sort of slid into the identifying problems in education part of the conversation, which is great. You know, that's fine. So let's look at problems. What problems do you see? Is there anything that you've thought about in preparing for this conversation that you think, yeah, actually, I think that we should talk about this?
Yeah, honestly, I think that it's all a problem. I think the whole system, if we were starting from here, that's the problem, is that we've got ourselves a system that is dysfunctional, doesn't work for large numbers of people. And I don't think it even works for society. I think it's a malfunctioning. If it was a car, it would be an Austin Princess. You know, it'd be look like it was put together by a committee and didn't, you know, the engine didn't work properly and it needed an overhaul. And it's
Right.
just it's a car. It kind of, you know, works, but it doesn't work very well. And so almost the best thing to do is to start from scratch.
Well, so that's a yeah. I can see what you're saying. Like, I recently interviewed Priya Lakhani. I don't know if you come across her. She's an ed tech entrepreneur, but she starts the book by using the analogy of Windows XP, which was like really sort of snazzy when it came out, and then it quickly became sort of problematic, and they put in loads and loads of patches and patches and patches until it was totally unworkable. And it feels like that's sort of what's happened. I think it's quite a good analogy to use with education. But I sometimes sort of just find it quite problematic when people say we need to scrap the whole thing and start again, because that's like just such an impossible thing to achieve. Like, what
Right.
we're just going to like close all the schools and sort of
Yeah.
like have a big meeting and all sort of decide on something better. So first of all, like when you say it's all a problem, can you identify like sort of what do you mean by that? Because, for example, one of my previous guests, Ian Cunningham, doesn't think that schools should exist at all. He thinks that they, overall, on balance, do more damage than they do good, and that we should think about different models of learning that are much more localized and much more about self-managed learning rather than being taught by external people, say. And that's a view to take, which is, a very, very strong view. But when you say it's all a problem, are you saying that the whole idea of schools is a problem? Is it the assessment system? Is it the way that we organise into subject disciplines? Like, what are can we get a bit granular in this conversation?
Yeah. I think that what I was going to follow, what I was saying was that it's an analogy, but it's not a very close analogy, because unlike XP, you can't say, right, we're going to scrap that and start again, because the whole system's not software. The whole system is hardware very largely. It's buildings, and I one of the things that I got very interested in at one point in the early 2000s was the idea of human scale education. I don't know if you've come across human scale education.
Yeah.
That it's that secondary schools in particular are just too large. They're physically too large. And obviously, that was very much an experience that I had as an 11-year-old. Going into a school with 2,000 people dehumanized everybody. And it was a very largely, it wasn't a problem with the people at the school. I don't think the problem was very largely to do with the size of it and the scale of it, and the fact that you were moving this number of people around every 40 minutes made things far worse than they needed to be. Now, realistically, that's what we've got. That's where we are. We can't scrap it and start from scratch. We have to patch it, and largely the conversations that we have in education are about even just like tiny things, like sometimes we end up having like these little, really tiny conversations about really small micro changes, and whether those things really make a difference or not. I think for me, my feeling about education is that, in terms of what a real change that we could make, would be to do with the assessment system. I think that we operate within an assessment system which is clearly flawed and has such a profound influence over of children's experience and teachers' experience of school and education. And I know this. I know this is true because I was teaching when SATs became a big thing in primary schools. And I saw, even in a school that I was working in, where we were doing everything in our power to not let those tests affect what was happening in the classroom, it did. It changed what happened in the classroom. It changed some of the things that we were doing with children. We started practicing for SATs. We weren't supposed to. We didn't want to. It was and still is something that's frowned upon, but we did because you'd be mad not to. And it had again, it's one of these things that I don't, they were introduced for good reasons, and the arguments that are made for having those tests are ones that the people who make them sincerely believe, but the unintended consequences, the unintended effects that those things have are profound, and they make a huge difference to children's experiences of school.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got human scale education, the size of schools. We've got the assessment system. Is there anything else in the problems column before we move on to thinking about alternatives?
Well, I think equality of opportunity is another thing that exists. That's a huge problem, and not one that has any simple solutions. But I think that, for example, if with Claire and I, we've got 3 children, all of whom have been through secondary school, and they went to a state secondary school, and we're not people with money, but we could afford for them to have private tuition for those parts of their education that they need a little bit of help with. So for 2 of them it was science, one of them it was maths, and it wasn't hugely expensive, but it was still a significant amount of money. And the fact that we could provide them with that financially, we could give them that extra support that meant that they could pass those exams. They didn't have to resit them, or they didn't feel that they were failing. They were helped with that. It's such an advantage. Now you magnify that advantage across the system, and you find that the whole system is intrinsically disorientated and disposed towards those people who have access to advantages that other people don't have. And I think that we need to find a way of having a system that doesn't mean that you are so disadvantaged if you don't have access to those kinds of resources.
So are you talking about private schools here?
I think private schools are the most obvious example of this, that if in our education system, right from the moment that it was conceived and built in the 19th century, private education was established and was there right from the beginning. So it's now so integrated into our education system that people do question it occasionally, and when they do, there's a big wailing and gnashing of teeth and a kind of, we can't possibly touch it. It's the crown jewels, and people come from all over the world to have their children educated in this country. But it is a really system. It is a real symptom of the inequality that exists in our education system, and I think an education system that is much more equitable wouldn't have private schools. They just wouldn't exist. And I think if you look at countries around the world that don't have those kinds of systems, their educational system is far more equitable.
Yeah, we can see that what was it, the spirit level, that book about how, you know, more equal societies are more happy societies, and there is obviously it was recently in the last election it was a Labour Party policy, wasn't it, that they were going to start to dismantle the private school system. And you can sort of see the moral case for it, can't you? Because, you know, a bit like we were talking about the 11 plus earlier, it's kind of like having the 11 plus, but instead of your ability being based on your ability to pass a test, it's just based on, you know, how wealthy your parents are. And so it does seem that it's sort of unfair that, you know, rich parents can send their kids to schools with amazing facilities and where they're sort of cocooned from life. And I think that it creates a stratified society, clearly, you know. And I've worked in a number of of private schools, not as a teacher but as a consultant, and you can get that sense that, you know, if you were you know, a very small child who's, you know, some of them look like Downton Abbey or something, like they look like these spectacular buildings, and you can imagine being in the back of your parents, you know, 4x4 or something, and you're driving through, you know, some part of London that's all rough, right? And you're going past places where there's boarded up houses, and you see people who are, you know, having to queue up to get on the bus to go to work in the morning and so on. And then you turn around the corner and all of a sudden you're in this leafy, gladed and incredible environment. It's hard to see how as a young child you wouldn't start to think of yourself as just like a sort of almost in a totally different world to other people. It really sort of, you know, you can see how it stratifies society. But the flip side of this, and this is something that I've thought about a lot, and I can't really get to the bottom of it, is like, although I can sort of see the moral case for saying, yes, this sort of is wrong, and I think that also it's not just that it's wrong, but it's that it's like it would be better. Society would be better if people mixed more as young people, right? So that they're sort of rubbing shoulders against people from all different walks of life. The thing that I struggle with private schools is that, like, they're amazing. like if you go and visit them and you spend some time in them and you work with those kids and you work with those teachers and you see the facilities, like you wouldn't not want that for your kid. Like if that was the local school down the road, you would be chuffed to bits that your kid is going to that place. And I think that one of the arguments that I've heard used against it is that it would almost be like an act of vandalism, is the word that's been used. It's obviously an emotive word, but it's like, if we're going to take something that is amazing and we're going to sort of level the playing field so that everything sort of becomes a bit more average, then that's not cool. And I can't really get to the bottom of that argument. I think that it's quite compelling, personally.
I don't think there's any argument that some of these private schools are amazing places, but then look at the amount of money they get per head of student. They flipping well should be amazing places. You know, I don't even know what the fees are. What, they £3,000-4,000 a year?
Oh, what? No, like for the highest private schools, it's something like 30. I think it's £36,000 a year.
Okay, that shows how naive I am. Yeah,
it's a lot. It's a lot of money. It's a lot more than the national. I think the national average income is sort of, is it the low 20s? So it's like 50% higher than the national average income.
So again, I don't really know what the current per head of what you get per student. I mean, back when I was a deputy head, it was about £2,200 a year for a primary school student in school.
Yeah, I talked about this with Ian Cunningham because he's been involved in this. I think that now schools are given roughly 5,000 or 6,000 per pupil.
At secondary, though.
That might be at secondary. Yeah, it might be a bit lower at primary.
Right. So, you know, immediately you've got that massive disparity in terms of, you know, seven times the amount per student. So, yeah, these places should be amazing, but they're amazing for a small minority of people. And I don't see how I can see the benefit, the enormous benefit for those for those children whose parents can afford to send them there. And how many prime ministers? I know this is in your book. I've forgotten. How many prime ministers have come from Eton?
I think there's 20 from Eton. We've had about 50 odd prime ministers, and 30 odd of them have come from 3 schools.
Right. So, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about what's their experience of life if they've been in that world, that closeted world, that world of privilege, and then how are they going to run the country? And so, okay, all right. So yes, it would be an act of vandalism to stop doing that, but that would create a fairer, a more equitable society. But I think the problem with this is when we get into these things, I sound like an old trot or something, and I'm not. I'm really not that kind of. I'm not into tearing things down and not having. I think the whole kind of Labour Party thing, suddenly, we're going to get rid of private schools. Let's stick that in our manifesto. I mean, that's just not how you go about things. It's not. If it's going to be something that's going to change, it has to be an idea that is an argument that's won over time, an argument that says, well, look, we as a society have come to a place now where these things are no longer appropriate. They're no longer. We don't want these places to exist anymore.
Yeah.
Not. We're going to vote for it and get rid of it, and we haven't really thought about what we're going to put in its place. That's just silly stuff. It's childish.
I agree. We're back to the top-down thing, and I think that people often don't realise that politics is, to a large extent, downstream of culture. If you look at the way that the Tories brought in, like, gay marriage, for example, like, that was not like dreamed up in some Tory think tank. That was like the country has already decided that gay marriage should be a thing, and we're just sort of just catching up, and so I think that you're right. I mean, in terms of like what practically could be done to sort of to level the playing field more in terms of educational provision. I mean, I don't honestly know much about the legality of it. I remember this coming up on Question Time once, and Dimbleby said something like, it's not even legally possible. I don't know what it is, but it's like he didn't think that it was even technically possible. I'm not sure that that's true because we live in a law-based country, right? Like there's no Bill of Rights, as it were. We can just pass laws and that becomes the new thing. So I don't see how you couldn't change it by passing a law. I'm not quite sure what he meant there. People talk about taking away their charitable status, which, as I understand it, would make it quite difficult for them to run. I think that lots of them would close if that happened because actually the margins are pretty slim in many of them, and some of the most expensive ones are 36 grand a year. Like that's like Rodine and Eton and all that. But there are many others. There's a whole range of them, and it's a sort of sliding scale. My wife works in a private school, but it's very low cost, and so on.
Well, again, see, I don't. I'm not in favour of abolishing them or taking away their charitable status so that they can't effectively operate. I don't. That isn't how this things change. It's, as you say, that politics is downstream of culture. And I was thinking, as you were saying that when I was at school, it was quite common. I think I mentioned it earlier to cane kids. I mean, caning was part of our school. We had a teacher who had a leather strap that was underneath his jacket, a long leather strap like a belt, and he would whip this out and slam it down on the desk, and threaten to hit you with it if you didn't, shut up and listen. And that was common practice in secondary schools in the 1970s. I don't know what happened in grammar schools, but in the school that I was in, that was common practice. There was teachers with slippers and canes, ball rubbers were routinely thrown at people, kids. That was something that wasn't, that was normal. And now, because of the government didn't get rid of that ahead of the cultural change happened that made those things unacceptable. Now nobody talks about those things as if they're acceptable. They become completely, and that's within my lifetime, they become completely unacceptable. And I think that that's how things change, that over time, culture and ideas, they become things that people discuss. And I think that general movement, if you're talking about things that I'm optimistic about, is I think that general movement is towards progress. Have you ever come across a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature? It's by Steven Pinker.
Yeah, I have.
It's that idea that if you look at things in the short term, it feels like everything's bad and getting worse. But if you look at things over a longer time period, things are generally getting better and heading towards a more fairer, equitable, and safer, happier society.
Yeah,
And
the arc of history tilts towards progress is the phrase, isn't
right.
it? There are counter views to that. There's a fascinating book by a guy called John Gray called Straw Dogs. I don't know if you've come across that, which offers a counter view of this, this belief in progress. So essentially, you're saying that it's too soon to get into arguments about charitable status and so on. That there needs to be, if this is going to happen, it needs to be something that sort of ferments and develops a head of steam within the wider culture. Okay, let's talk briefly. Go on.
Sorry, just one more thing about that, because is that when I bridled at the word movement when you talked about mentally expert, it's because it's the same idea, is that you don't change things, I don't think, from doing this kind of campaigning or changing education, saying, oh, we're all going to start teaching mentally expert. Let's roll this out. Let's go and set the Ofsted off on people who don't do mentally expert lessons. It's about seeding things that over time, probably much longer than I'll be around, that become ideas that are reasonable ideas that people look at and go, yeah, well, those things work. We should be doing those things. And that's how change happens. It happens through reasonableness.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So the other two things you mentioned were the assessment system being flawed, and there's already quite a lot of activity going on around that with this sort of coalition of people who've been involved, the rethinking assessment. And I was involved in an interesting discussion about that last night and about the extent to which it is solution focused, because these are the questions that we wrestle with when we're talking about rethinking education. We don't want to be too focused on problems. We want to actually look at what are alternatives. So in terms of the assessment system, there are a number of alternatives that are being looked at currently, and I don't think that we've really got time to explore those at the moment, but this is something that's happening more widely. But I'd like to close, if I may, we've got about 10 minutes, with the idea of human scale education, because I agree with you that secondary schools in particular and some primary schools are too big, and that is quite a fundamental structural problem that causes problems. Then you use the word dehumanizing, and I think that that's exactly true. I talked about an example in my interview with Ian, where it just, there was an incident that happened, and because I didn't know the kid and the kid didn't know me, it just sort of all felt a bit out of control and a bit unsafe, and I think that bad things happen when people are dehumanized in that way. But thinking about the practicalities of it, if you think about, for example, just the numbers of people that there are, and the numbers of, the number of subjects that you have to teach, right? And so you need to have sort of X numbers of people, and to make it economic, if you had a sort of a primary school, let's say you had a 2-form entry size to a secondary school, would that be economic? And would you be able to have a sort of a science lab with science specialists and history and drama and music and PE and all of those resources and all of the expertise that that sort of goes into creating a secondary school, if you shrunk it down? And I know that some people have looked at a schools within schools approach, where they've sort of divided the school into little mini schools, and that seems to be one idea that could have legs, but I've not really seen it work that widely in this country. I think it's been more widely practiced in the States. Have you thought much about this? How can we reduce the scale down so that we make this much closer to your primary experience and less like your experience at secondary?
Yeah, so as I say, at one point I got very interested in this and read quite widely and looked at some of the ideas that were being posited. And there were some experiments with the early academies. This was when the academies were originally instigated. during the Blair era, and there were some new builds, and they started looking at I can't remember the name. There's a name of a school which I can't remember, but they took the idea of human scale education and said, well, how can we solve this problem of having the resources that we need for physical education and science and those other things, the art department and whatever, while still maintaining the idea of a human scale. Human scales are roughly 140, if I'm right. That's the idea, isn't it? That you have communities are made up of roughly 140 people.
Yeah, there's this idea of the Dunbar's number. Dunbar was an anthropologist who said that there's roughly about a sort of 150 people is like the maximum number that you can hold in your mind, or that you can have a meaningful relationship with at any one time, say.
Right. So if you're in a community of that many people, then you'll recognise their faces. You won't know all their names, but they are people that you can maintain some kind of human contact or human relationship with. And what they did with these schools was they took a big school of 1,500 people and they divided it up into smaller communities, so that those children would get to know the people in their community and would spend time with the same teachers. So as a teacher, you'd work in that. I suppose it's a small school, which, if you think about it, in private schools have known this for a very long time. That's why they have houses. Houses are smaller communities within a larger school community, so that you get to know the people in your house. You get to know you have somebody who you're an adult that you form a close relationship with, who knows you, knows your name, knows your family, knows about you, and that feels to me that's something that it's not beyond human wit to work these things out. I don't have the answers to all these things. I don't work in secondary education. I haven't spent a huge amount of time thinking about these things in great depth. But I know that if we started to have that kind of conversation, it was like when I heard you talking to Deborah Kidd, you were talking about different kinds of exams. It's like we don't even want to think about these things. We don't even want to broach the subject. We don't even want to consider. They just kind of go, oh, well, it's not perfect. There's lots of things wrong with it, but, it's the best we've got, so we'll just carry on. I don't think that's how progress is made. I think progress is made by saying, it's not working. Well, let's look at it. Let's examine it. I don't know what the answer is to this, but I know that we can work at it. We can look at other examples from around the world and see how they're doing it, and maybe we can get some ideas from there. But we've always, in this country, I've always felt that we're sort of part of the vanguard. I think we've thought about education in innovative ways. We've sort of tend to be, I think, as a profession in this country, people who are looking outwards all the time and looking at ideas from other places and trying things out. I think that there are ways of doing these things, and I imagine that technology is going to play a part in it as well. I think we're just of it. I don't know what your other guests who know much more about this have said, but it feels to me like we're just at the cusp of something major that's going to happen in technology. That technology is starting. As Moore's law is starting to be realised in significant ways, and over the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see huge major advances in AI technology and virtual reality and other things that could potentially transform how children experience education. But I don't. When you start talking about that, you sound like a futurist, and then it's all like could happen, might happen, but don't really know.
Well, I think it's already happening, and coronavirus has obviously been a massive catalyst in this, but like the world of work has changed massively. Like I don't have to. I've been basically at home for most of this year, and I've been working with schools, and it works really well. I've been delivering MPQSL training to teachers. That works really well, and I don't need to spend 5 hours on a train going to and from. And I think that similarly, we can look at, like, what do we actually need for young people to be going into schools every single day for the same amount of time, when we can work this much more efficiently. And I think that there are downsides to screen time, and I wouldn't want to move to a solely distance learning model, but equally there are many upsides to this. And it's clear that it's already happening and that it's not gonna stop anytime soon. The technology is getting better and better. You know, if COVID had hit 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had the bandwidth to even probably be able to have this podcast conversation without Skype crashing every 5 minutes. But now, you know, we can get there. So I think that it is already happening. And I agree with you that you know, human scale education is not beyond the wit, and there are definitely things that we can do within very large secondary schools and primary schools to make this a little bit sort of smaller. And I think that the schools within schools model, you know, is probably the way to go, rather than, you know, getting rid of secondary schools altogether and, you know, just building a load of primary school size schools. I think that we can just work with what we've got.
Sure. And, you know, I did some work in Belgium a few times, and in Belgium their system is that the children go to school early. I don't know what time, 7:30, I think, and then they have a particular school, and they have a kind of rather formal education, and they finish at lunchtime, and then in the afternoon they often go to another place entirely, where they have a much more kind of vocational education in the afternoon. So that may be in the arts, or they may be doing mechanics, or they may be doing you know, music or whatever. And those things are much more those things are chosen by the students themselves. So the morning is a kind of a generic kind of education, where they follow a curriculum that's kind of nationwide, I think. But in the afternoon they follow a much more individualistic vocational route. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the route, that's the way we want to go, but it's just looking at things and saying, well, look, this isn't an inevitability, the way that we organise education. It doesn't have to be this way. Perhaps, like you say, in a few years' time, and it may be not very long, a lot of those things, or some parts of those kind of generic things where we move children around and from one room to the next to teach them kind of things that could be taught better at home, you know, could be taught in a much, I mean, this kind of way of working doesn't work terribly well with kids, but the technology is advancing very quickly, and we're moving towards perhaps a time when it will be both engaging and educational to work for some of the time using a computer. Our three kids are all at university or college or higher education, and they're doing all of their learning online. Now, that's not perfect, and there should be, you know, in an ideal world, they should be going to, but they can do quite a lot of it online. And so maybe school buildings can be used for part of the day, or they're used all day, but by different groups of children going in at different times. Now, there's logistical problems to that. You know, a lot of the reasons why schools are open now isn't really to do with children's education. It's more to do with keeping the economy going so that parents can get back to work. So what do you do with kids if they're at home studying and the parents are at work? Well, there's a problem.
Yes, indeed. And that is a problem that we're going to leave as a cliffhanger, because we need to draw this to a close. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this morning. I've really enjoyed talking to you, to hearing more about Mantle the Expert in particular.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed it as well. It's been it's really lovely having the opportunity to talk about it, really. And as you say, having the technology that allows us to be able to do it as well has been great. We've known each other for a long time, and we've met once or twice, but this has been great.
Yes, indeed. The first of many, I hope.
Yeah, that would be good.
Time is a measure of change. We don't have much time. Time is a measure of change. We don't have much time. Time is a measure of change. We don't have much time. Time is a measure of change. And if we don't try to change.
They call him clever, faster than lightning. No one you see is smarter than he. And we don't play